So the question is, what are the lessons learned with regard to the EDI? And of course, you can go in many different directions, but I want to start with one thing in terms of what's been the most successful thing to communicate what we've learned from the EDI to the different stakeholder groups. And in a way, it's very simple, but in another way, it's very profound, I think. And I've briefly alluded to that yesterday when I talked about Clyde Hertzman. I'm just curious, how many of you actually have met or know Clyde Hertzman? Okay, a fair amount. So yesterday I said Clyde would go to every single small place that was interested in listening to EDI results. So this is not, don't worry about the slides for now. So as you know, BC is a large province, the same way all the province territories in BC are very large, geographically speaking. So it's a large area with often very not that densely populated. So it's a large area to cover, and some of the areas are very hard to reach. So how do you communicate effectively with these hard-to-reach places, with all these different communities? And yes, we have technology, yes, we have internet, yes, we have all these means to disseminate information. At the end of the day, the one thing that I thought was the most important to really get the discussion on the EDI going is having people like Clyde and others, of course, go out into the communities and talk to people about it. It was the number one thing that made people interested in this. And I'll give you a couple of examples. And in the recent years, of course, I have increasingly have made those experiences too. You go into a school and people may have heard about the EDI, they may have seen a couple maps, they may have seen a result, they may have heard that there's a vulnerability rate of 30% in our province. But the moment we have a researcher who has done the research on this, or one of our team, go into the school or into the community or talk to the community professionals, they can ask all the questions and they can raise all the concerns they have and validate those with whoever's in the room. And I think, yeah, again, it may be simple, but I think it's profound. It's the one, I think it's the most single important thing to have this ongoing discussion between people who do the work and the people who want to use the evidence that we're creating as a group for whatever work they are doing. Related to that are a few things, and that, I think, gets into the social psychology of what motivates us. When you have a tool like the EDI and you talk about children, it's a topic that most people are naturally interested in. A lot of people, well, first of all, if you have children, chances are you're going to be interested in hearing and talking about your children. Most people who don't yet have children or don't have children at all, they're also interested in the well-being of our society. So it's a topic that a lot of people are naturally interested in. So that's, of course, good and nice. At the same time, people can get very sensitive about it. We talk about vulnerability. We talk about teachers supporting them. We talk about professionals supporting them. So the moment you talk about vulnerability and kids not doing well, people also naturally very easily get defensive. And so I'll tell you one story about how I walked into a classroom at UBC. This is all with people who are interested in early child development, so teachers, professionals, people who are just preparing to go into the field. And one of the students, it was a master's student, so she had done a teaching degree, then went out to teach, was a kindergarten teacher, so she had already filled out the EDI a couple of times. So she knew about it, she knew the maps, she had a lot of information. Before I got in, the teacher and colleague of mine of the course, sorry, the instructor of the course, she said, well, there's this one person, she knows the EDI, she has done it a couple of times, she's really interested, but be prepared, she's going to be really negative. And I thought, okay, why is that? She had all these complaints, but it wasn't specified at that point. I went into the classroom, I talked about the EDI, and the moment there were a couple of questions exchanged and her concerns get validated, everything seemed to be fine. In fact, I couldn't tell, she didn't tell me who it was. I couldn't tell from the discussion who it was. And then after that, she said, the instructor said to me, this is amazing. The person was so negative about it. The moment she could raise all her concerns, ask all the questions, and see that we as researchers are having the same questions and we're dealing with the same, and we're looking at them, all of a sudden we had a conversation, and she felt validated in her concerns, and then we had a discussion about more of the details of the data. So again, it's maybe a simple story, but we've seen it over and over and over again. If you go into these rooms of professionals and teachers and ECD workers and so forth, early child development workers, the moment you go into those rooms and they can ask all the questions they have, you listen to their concerns, they see what our concerns, that they often overlap, and then how carefully we have looked at the data over the past 10 years. That's one of the most valid ways to establish a connection. And then you have a discussion, and from that you build. I have to say, in terms of timing, so
6 minutes. No, you have 10 minutes now.
Okay, and yeah. So I go in one complete block. I don't know. Okay, is that how we want to do it, or we go back and forth?
Oh, back and forth. 15 minutes.
Yeah, but I.
We don't go back and forth.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. The floor is yours for another 10 minutes.
So having said all this, so that I think that's really absolutely instrumental, and of course it means that you have to have people who can afford to do that, who have the time to do that, and also of course the interest in doing it. And even though I mentioned Clyde as an example, Kim Schoenert-Reichel, who has been working on us with a survey for the grade 4 and grade 7 students, same thing. She has been willing to go to every school that would invite her in the Lower Mainland. If you go to presentation with her in the Lower Mainland, chances are, no matter which school it is, there's a handful of of parents who already know her. Oh, hi Kim, how are you doing? You know, they took a course with her, they heard her in other presentations. Those personal connections are absolutely crucial. They also create the trust that in the system that we're allowed to come in and collect all this information. You all know this is a big ask. This is every kindergarten teacher spending half a day or longer, depending on how many they fill out, to give this information, and then they are sometimes even supposed to do something about it. So we are asking for their time. When we go into these presentations, we always come in with an ask that they spend time on this. So unless there's this trust that we're doing something meaningful and valid with the data, they're not going to let us do this. And the trust comes through these conversations. There's a lot of credibility established by people going in and listening to all these questions and going back between the expertise that we have from the research side and connecting that with the expertise all the professionals bring from their, and of course the parents from their everyday experiences. So all that being said, let me go through a couple of maps and just tell a couple additional stories in terms of how the maps, in conjunction with having these discussions, I think is extremely effective in engaging different audiences. So here's one report for the EDI from the last wave, wave 5, for one of our school districts. So SD stands for school district. They're all numbered. We have about 60 in BC. And can I go to a presenter view here? In these reports, we give an overview of the whole district in terms of the EDI results. And here's a map that you may have seen in similar versions, of course, yesterday or in other contexts. So this is the city of Coquitlam with all the different neighborhoods. And this is just the bird's eye view, just the overall vulnerability rate. And in our particular case, we've changed the maps over the years slightly. So now what you see is the darker the red, the more vulnerability, the worse it is. The lighter the red, the better it is, less vulnerability. So if you just look at a couple of neighborhoods, you see, for example, here, Coquitlam River, over 40% vulnerability. Right next to it, you have Port Coquitlam North, 25. So you sometimes see two neighborhoods, and the vulnerability rates are often twice as much. In some of the most extreme, where you have 3 times the vulnerability of one neighborhood, and right next door you have. So none of you, I think, lives in Coquitlam, so I wish I could have brought a map of Montreal or Quebec City or what have you. of course, it's really important, of course, to talk about their kids. So imagine this is your own place. The moment you show data about your kids, the discussion is completely then, if I were to show, well, in this case, Coquitlam, the engagement is completely different because you can't relate to these neighborhoods. So of course, this is something, you know, we can't create now because I don't have your local map. But imagine it's your local map. Automatically, just by showing the map, you have a discussion going. I often have been invited where they say, can you just give us a 10, 15-minute overview? And then 2 hours later, we're still talking. And I say, you know what, sorry, I have to, you know, be home or at, you know, whatever. Because people get so engaged, they want to know about their own children. So having the maps locally and representatively for 80, 90% of the population, of course, is important. And again, that's not something new. But then again, having these discussions about what's meaningful for the children in those communities, why is it that the one neighborhood right next to us is doing so well, and why is it that we're not doing well? And then people come up with their own theories and their own hypotheses. And then the next piece that's really instrumental is to give them the research evidence that shows what are good things for children in general. Then they can relate that, is that something we're already doing in our communities? And putting these maps next to, and I don't have slides for that to put it side by side, but so you start with the maps, you have the discussion going, and then people create their own hypotheses, and they wonder, what is it that we're doing or not doing? And then you go through some of the research the same way yesterday I talked about attachment or play. So you put those side by side, then again people can wonder, is that something we're actually thinking about or not? Thanks. And then finally, and this is something a school superintendent mentioned a few times, and I've heard it in other cases too. It's great to have data, it's great to have research, but in order to make it related to what people are doing from a day-to-day experience, we need the stories. He always said we need the data and the stories side by side. If you only have data, you lose a lot of the audiences very quickly because data can be very quickly become abstract. The same with research findings. If you show correlation coefficient, how many of your teachers are going to be interested in a correlation coefficient? If you show one graph showing a scatter plot, maybe it's a bit more interesting because you're showing a correlation visually and they can relate to that a bit more easily. If you just bring the research findings, you don't capture the whole audience. If you bring stories that can connect directly to the findings you're presenting and to the research background you're presenting, you capture the audience in a different way. And I'm not sure if it has been the same here, but when it came to bullying and these very traumatic experience where people after being bullied took their own lives, of course these are extreme, but how sometimes these dramatic individual stories, they of course capture the interest or the imagination of your audience very, very quickly. But it also goes the other way around with very positive stories. So if there are different stories that, for example, Kim Schonert-Reichel would repeatedly tell about this one little girl who showed all these signs of resilience. So it was a little video clip of 2-3 minutes showing how this girl did relatively well despite all the odds being against her. So it's a lot of signs of resilience. So you connect a story to an individual, and very quickly we all can see children similar to that girl or similar to that boy. We can make the connections to our own children, the children in our communities. And by connecting those stories then to the research findings and to the maps, you often bring different pieces of information side by side that is really useful. And then will end with one final comment. And this comes back to the importance of interaction. You could, at least in theory, do all these things on the internet. I could put up a presentation of a story, have a little clip about this girl showing her story. I could have a narrated version of the map. I give you a report on attachment theory and what have you, and the importance of play. How does this all relate to the contextual information that all the expertise that's in the community? Because people often ask us, so okay, if these are the findings from the EDI, what should we be doing? What does that exactly mean? And well, we can tell, well, this is the relationships we're seeing, this is what the research says, this is our own experience. But at the end of the day, if we come into your community with all the cultural and social specific challenges and resources you have, we can't fully interpret this information without contextualizing and what's in place locally. And that's again why it's important to have these discussions face to face, so that we can put those side by side in a conversation and make all the important connections. So I'll leave it this for now, and then again I'm curious about the questions later on. Thank you.
Donc, on comprend qu'il faut créer une histoire. Donc, on va continuer l'histoire avec Madame Perron maintenant. Et puis, on va revenir aux questions après les trois présentations. Donc, Madame Perron.
Merci, thank you. I wanted to talk in English because I want to make sure that we sort of build on each other's stories rather than do a lot of repetition. Because we've all been working with EDI for so long, I think that the stories can be very similar. So I'm going to focus on the community coalition, community development piece, because I think that, well, first of all, that's the piece I know the best, since I was in charge of it. After 5 years of working on this project, there's a lot of things that I'm walking away with as the door closes. I think the first one was learning how data matters. Data matters to people in community, and it is such a mobilizing agent to bring people together. We can talk about early childhood, and let's face it, a lot of the people that we were working with at the community level already knew that some of their kids were vulnerable and were experiencing great difficulty. But to see it translated into evidence and into numbers made a huge amount of difference. One of the things that we were surprised by, I think my staff, when they first started going out to communities and started talking about the data, felt this sense of intimidation that maybe parents and community members would not be interested. So how do you make that come to life? And I think, as Martin showed, the use of maps was a really good tool to be able to translate that data into a way that was very consumable for people. And we found that it was actually a bigger carrot, a bigger piece of engagement than dollars. So I mentioned yesterday that all of our coalitions were given a seed grant. They were given $50,000 at the community level to turn passion into action. And there was an assumption that that would be the thing that mobilized communities. You give them money, they'll want to come to the table, they'll want to participate. When in fact, as our doors are closing and the government has continued to fund the coalitions are rallying and saying, that's not good enough. You can't just throw money at us and not continue to give us this information about our children. That is the piece that was critically important. That also translated into one of the challenges we had in Alberta around active consent. We're one of the only provinces where the EDI, we needed active consent by parents. So just to make that clear, parents actually had to sign a form saying we could EDI their children. In most other provinces, they don't have that. They have passive consent, where you actually have to sign if you don't want your child EDI'd. We thought that that would be a huge barrier in our ability to collect data. My feeling from a community development perspective was that if it's about us, include us, which means that if we're collecting information on children, we should let the parents know, and they should actively participate in that process. And so it was the first stage of community development in my mind. But here's what we found. 88% consent rate across the province. That's huge. That required kindergarten teachers to actually have conversations with parents about early childhood, why we were doing this, what the benefits would be at the community level, and then also give them an opportunity to share back the data once we had it in hand. And that became a really valuable process. And we found that as the years unfolded, over the 5 years, that the consent rate actually increased because teachers were so engaged in this and valued the information so much. Some of the other learnings were around relationships. Relationships matter when you're working with communities. I talked yesterday about our strategy of using a cup of coffee. That's the one thing that we don't have enough time for in our work. Those conversations where you're sharing information about who you are in the world, what you do, what you have to offer. I don't know about you, but I sit on a lot of committees where, you know, I'm the representative for so-and-so, and you work together for 2-3 years, and at the end of the 3 years, you can barely articulate what it is the people around the table are doing, because you're focused on this one piece of agenda, but you never take the time to really unpack each other, sort of get to know what it is your community is doing. Hence the experience I had in some of the small communities in Alberta, where I was really surprised by people not knowing what was in their community, despite the fact that they knew each other. One of the approaches we used in community development was the IKEA effect. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So the IKEA effect came out of a research at Harvard University. Researchers asked participants to estimate the value of 2 pieces of furniture that were identical, except for one fact. One was already put together, complete. The other one was in pieces, and they had to put it together before they estimated its value. Now, strangely enough, participants estimated the value of the one that they had to put together as being almost 90% higher than the one that was already put together for them, which really formed the basis of our approach to community development in Alberta. It was let them create and be the architect of their own journey at the community level. People have to develop it themselves. If we want buy-in, it can't be downloaded. It can't be top-down. We can't tell them what to do. They have to figure it out themselves. And we were asked many times why we had not provided a framework or a checklist of things communities needed to do to be effective. And the reason was there's strength in the struggle. So if you want a group of people to really learn how to work collaboratively, it's important for them to struggle through those aspects rather than to be given a form that they can follow. We achieved so much success, as a matter of fact, that one of the other ministries funded a research project around the efficacy of coalitions in Alberta. And I just want to show you one quick slide that sort of really highlights some of the things that we learned. I'm just going to go from the beginning. These are the factors that affect coalition sustainability. So the question we asked at the very beginning of the research project was, what contributes to a group of individuals being really successful in working collaboratively? And some of the things that came out of this, one was leadership. Leadership is incredibly important. It doesn't matter what you do. If you have a group of people that are passionate and well-intentioned, if they don't have somebody at the helm that is willing to create that shared vision and that sort of overall picture of where that group wants to go, it's going to be hard-pressed to go anywhere. The second piece was, not a surprise, was the quality of relationship. How much time do people take to make sure that the direction they're going in is aligned? And having a really strong vision and purpose. So actually knowing what it is you're working for. We had some coalitions that were a year into the process only to discover that they were all talking about something different when they were talking about play. Because what play meant for one person was completely different than what it meant to someone else. And so taking the time right at the front to create that shared vision, common language, and being on the same page, if you will, was really, really important. Some of the other things that we found were really important was the community history. As we went out into communities, some of the things that we discovered was that we were dealing with small p politics. We had some communities that were side by side that refused to work with each other because of a long-standing history of not working with each other. We had communities where organizations often were competing for the same pot of dollars, and so they had trouble sitting around the same table and collaborating because their agendas got in the way. So in terms of building sustainability for coalitions, we really recognize the value in doing a lot of the work up front, getting some real champions, and getting some quick wins right from the beginning. One of the other lessons we learned was around the data. And thank you. No community is without vulnerable children. Not a single one, not even a sub-community on a smaller level. And so it is everybody's business. And one of the strategies we used, even in communities that were doing really well, was that tell us what it is you're doing then. If your children are doing well, don't disengage, don't go hide in the corner, don't, say we don't need this. Tell us what you're doing that is contributing to the children's success in your community so we can learn from you. We had some communities that were, we call them cross-diagonal communities, where the socioeconomic factors in the community were quite low, so there weren't a lot of protective factors. However, the kids were doing really well. As we started having conversations with communities, and oftentimes they were really small communities, we found that the quality of relationship that people had at the community level, the events that they had that brought people together on an informal basis, contributed to that. So, and I guess as I wrap up, I want to reiterate that over the 5 years, we really recognize that if we say it takes a village to raise a child, we are the village. It's not your village. It's not an organization's village. It's not programs and services. We are the village, which means we all have a shared responsibility to support our young children. And one of the things we've been fighting for in Alberta is to make early childhood non-negotiable. We don't mess around with grade 12, grade 11. We don't say, hey, the economy tanks, you know what, we're going to take that off the table. But we do in early childhood. As soon as we want to save money, we take money out. That's where we take it from. If we want to make things more efficient, you take early childhood off the table. We don't have a lot in early childhood that is absolutely non-negotiable, that we can feel confident is going to move forward. And so that's been our platform, has been that all the services and supports that young children and families need should be non-negotiable. And I think I'll pass it on to Catherine on that note.
Yeah.
I don't have any slides for you. I'll try and speak slowly because I think my accent might be a little bit of a problem for some of you. But nevertheless, in Australia we use this expression actually in literature. Writers... That's my first faux pas. In literature they use an expression called, and they say, kill your darlings. Has anyone ever heard that expression before? People who are serious writers, literature buffs, will often use that expression because often they want to write about the thing that they feel most passionate about. And in writing what they feel most passionate about, they sometimes lose sight of their audience. And so sometimes the message that they're trying to convey is a little bit lost. And so I think it's a very difficult expression to use when you're working in early childhood, kill your darling, but it's an expression which actually does have meaning that helps me when I'm speaking to larger audiences. The EDI actually ended up being, for us in Australia, a very good conversation starter. It became something that brought academics, politicians, policymakers, and communities together. And that was essential to actually, I suppose, bring together the whole population to think about how we could improve outcomes for children. We talked yesterday about how important the evidence is. Even though we have the evidence, we often don't listen, and we don't hear what the evidence is telling us. If you look at the EDI, for example, and you look at the people who actually created the EDI, including people like Dan Orford, he was an adolescent psychiatrist. He was interested in knowing who were those children who were going to have difficulty when they became adolescents. And he took great interest in the emotional questions, as many of the people at UCLA who are doing research at the moment around emotional outcomes are also continuing to do. Those specific questions can tell us, and I hope Martin can actually reassure me on this one, but the questions around the emotional domain are predictive of young people who are going to have difficulty. And even though we know this, and even though we continue to collect this data, and in BC and Ontario they've been collecting this data for a very long time, we still don't seem to be getting the message. And yet we constantly report, as was shown in the slide that Martin showed yesterday, that mental health is a growing issue for all of us to attend to, whether we be in school or community or whether we're looking at our own children. So the EDI helps us see progress. It helps us see progress over time. It helps us understand the elements that make a difference to a child's life, even though we all know the child sits in the middle of an environment which includes many other people. We need to be reminded. We also need to be reminded that children who actually show difficult behaviours and are having a difficult time dealing with life are likely to have difficulty when they become adolescents. And then when they become older people, and at 70, they can still tell you that when they were an adolescent, this is when these problems became apparent to them. Even though we have all this evidence, we still have to be reminded. The other thing is, in community, you see things that others do not. You can put yourself into the shoes of another in your community and you understand what's going on because you understand the context. It's important to have that community voice at the table in government with the policymakers. Politicians read the front page of the local newspaper. Every day they have advisors who collect the newspaper. They read as many newspapers as possible, but the paper they pay most attention to is the popular newspaper, the trashy one, the one that says, you know, everyone is concerned about such and such. The world is going to end tomorrow. Christmas is the end of the world. People start the politicians listen to this. They want to do something about it. They want to know what the popular think because the popular are going to vote for them. So it's important that community has a voice and can actually have words to actually describe to politicians and others what they are concerned about and what they are doing. And I think one of the things that we don't do very well in community, and I have worked across all the spaces, we don't tell the stories of what works well. And telling those stories is important. And having people who can write the stories is important too. So the trick is that for community, I think, is that you become advocates for others. You become a voice, you become the champion for those in your community. And the value of the EDI cannot be underestimated in the same way that the value of human contact cannot be underestimated. As Martin quite rightly says, the data becomes abstract without the conversation. And so we do need to remember the conversation and we do need to take those conversations into different spaces. The other thing is the responsibility changes and the accountability changes and sometimes moves from one group to another. When you're writing policy, you need strong, well-organised government bureaucrats who understand what you want them to know and can write policy that helps you do good. When you're in the community, you need people who can go back to government, who can help government understand what it is that you need and what you're doing well. You don't want policies that come in and say, okay, you might be doing something good over there, but we're really not interested because we have an idea and this is what we want to impose on your community and this is how we want you to report back so you can get the next funding stream. And I think it's very sad when I hear Lynn say, as we close the door after 5 years, it's a tragedy. But I think one of the early lessons for me was in the state or the province that I come from, we were very keen, once the first collection finished, that we actually gather together and gather momentum so we could actually find the money to do a collection ourselves if the money wasn't forthcoming from the federal government. And I think when you understand the value of the data, you can mobilise communities to support you in doing that. It's very hard to ignore 1,000 people. It's very easy to ignore one person. And I think when you talk about public health, there was a very famous story about a public health physician in a lift at Johns Hopkins who was asked what he did by Michael Bloomfield. And I think he made a comment along the lines of, for every $1,000 you can save one person in acute health, in the acute healthcare system, but for every $1 you can save thousands in public health. And I think the story is a little bit the same here. The other thing is, so personal opinion is important, but the evidence helps us put personal opinion and what our knowledge into a space where others can actually understand. My background is in children's health, and I worked at the Children's Hospital in Melbourne for a long time. I was Director of Services there. And every week I read about 2,000 referrals from many places throughout the state and other places where they were trying to refer their children in. And the quality of the referral was very important. And I got to sift through those referrals very quickly. I would read them in bed, I'd read them when we were having dinner, I'd read them when I was feeding my children, I would read them wherever I was, I would read these referrals. The quality of the referral, the quality of the message is very important. But what I learnt there was that there are many people out there who really don't care enough. And if you do care enough, you'll find ways to mobilise together to get your messages across to those that need to hear them. So I think as difficult as government is, and as difficult as I found it working in government, I thought I wouldn't last 6 months. I found a way to make it work because I realised that I was there on behalf of other people. I can help people like Martin, and I can help people like Lynn in the same way that they can help me. And you, people in communities that I work with day in, day out, help me more than anyone because they give me the stories that I need to make the point in government. And a policy maker who comes to you and says, oh, we need to do something new. We thought we'd use the EDI. Can we use this data set? Of course you say yes, it's a very important data set. But as they walk away, you say to them, what else are you going to use? What other information do you have? And they often say to you, they don't say it to me now. They don't say it to me now. But they often say things like, oh, I'm too busy, the minister wants something, I have to do something immediately. The point is that's not good enough. That's being lazy. That's not a good policymaker. A good policymaker tries to get a context to put the data into to then deliver the message, which then is going to be less faulty and more possible to implement. Anyway, I think that's all I've got to say.
Okay.